right, so get this. For the past 35 years, the Chinese foreign minister's first trip of the year.
Every year.
Yeah, every year has always been to Africa.
It's quite a...
I know, right?
Right.
It's not Europe.
Yeah.
It's not the U.S.
Nope.
It's Africa. So what is behind this consistent focus? That's what we're going to unpack today.
Yeah.
Using this panel discussion with some real experts on China-Africa relations, they really went in and, analyzed this relationship from every angle, trade investment,
Security.
global influence, the whole 9 yards. Are you ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's get into it.
Okay, so this is not just some symbolic gesture, is it?
No, not at all. It really speaks to a long-term strategy on China's part.
Okay.
But they definitely see Africa's potential.
Yeah.
Its vast resources in that growing market.
I mean, the population growth there is just unbelievable.
Yeah.
Like, the future's there in terms of population.
Absolutely.
But it's not just about, China going in and securing access to resources, right?
Right.
This panel really dug into this idea of mutual benefit.
Yeah, they kept using that term, mutual benefit.
Right.
But I think we have to be careful, right? What does that actually mean in practice?
Yeah.
Because for China, it's securing those resources and markets,
Mm-hmm.
but also expanding its global influence,
Right.
challenging that, existing world order.
They want to be the top dog.
In a sense, they want to kind of change things up.
Right.
But then for the African nations, it's about attracting investment,
Of course.
driving economic development, and potentially gaining a new strategic partner.
Right. So both sides kind of have different motivations here.
Yeah, it's a complex equation.
It is.
For sure.
How does this mutual benefit thing, how does that play out when it comes to FCAC?
So FCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation,
Yes.
at the last summit, they elevated the relationship to a strategic level.
Oh, wow.
And there was some debate,
Oh, would I?
yeah, amongst the panelists about what that actually means.
Oh, interesting.
So one of the experts argued that it's more about optics than substance, while another pointed to specific agreements, particularly around debt restructuring, as evidence of this deepening partnership.
Debt restructuring.
Debt restructuring.
That's interesting. It kind of makes it sound like this partnership isn't always as rosy as it's portrayed.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
There are these inherent power imbalances at play.
Yeah.
And some African nations are finding themselves burdened by debt to China.
Right.
So the panelists really emphasize that African governments need to be savvy.
Savvy, yeah.
Negotiators.
Get good lawyers.
Yeah, make sure they're getting favorable terms and they're not falling into these debt traps.
Oh, for sure. So while there's all this talk of mutual benefit, African nations need to be cautious,
Absolutely.
strategic in their dealings with China.
Definitely.
For sure. Now, another area where this relationship gets really interesting is energy.
Yeah.
Africa has these massive energy needs.
Absolutely. And China is investing heavily in this sector.
Yeah, so this recent agreement under FOCAC, where China committed to supporting the development of a massive solar energy project in West Africa.
Yeah, it's huge.
This is expected to provide clean energy to millions of people, create thousands of jobs.
It has the potential to be transformative.
But did anyone on the panel raise any concerns about this? I mean, it sounds great, but are there any downsides?
Well, some of the panelists question the long-term sustainability of these projects.
Okay.
Like what happens when the Chinese support dries up?
Right.
They raised concerns about technology transfer and the potential for Chinese companies to dominate the market.
So even when we're talking about renewable energy, which is, a good thing,
Right.
we still need to have that scrutiny.
Yeah.
We need to have the transparency
Transparency is key.
to make sure that these projects truly benefit African nations in the long run.
Exactly. And it has to be sustainable,
Right.
like you said.
Yeah. And this leads to another crucial point that the panel brought up.
Mm-hmm.
The need for African nations to move beyond just exporting raw materials.
They kept saying value addition.
Value addition. Okay,
Yeah.
so what does that mean?
So instead of just, shipping out iron ore or timber,
The raw stuff.
the raw materials,
Yeah.
they need to start processing these resources locally,
Right.
making finished products within their own borders.
Okay.
And they had a fascinating example.
Oh, yeah.
A Chinese-backed steel plant in East Africa.
Oh, wow.
Now it's controversial because of environmental concerns.
Right.
But it's created jobs and boosted local economies by actually transforming those raw materials into steel products.
That are used right there.
Used within the region.
Yeah. So they're not just shipping out the raw materials.
Exactly.
They're processing it, making something with it,
Adding value.
adding value, and then
Keeping those profits local.
keeping the profits local.
Okay.
Right. So it's about bringing that manufacturing and processing to Africa, keeping more of the profits, creating a more diversified economy.
Exactly.
But isn't that where things get a little sticky? Because
Mhm.
China historically has been a major importer of raw materials.
Well,
Right. So wouldn't this shift toward value addition potentially disrupt their own economic model?
Yeah, and that was a big debate amongst the panelists.
I'll bet.
Some of them argued that China is truly committed to supporting Africa's industrialization,
Okay.
seeing it as a way to create new markets for their own goods and services.
Right. So they'll sell them the finished product.
Exactly.
Okay.
But then others were a little more skeptical. They said that, maybe China will only support value addition in certain sectors that don't directly compete with their own industries.
So it's not just about, being nice.
No,
There's self-interest involved.
of course.
So it's complex.
It is a complex situation.
There are potential benefits, but also potential pitfalls for African nations.
Yeah, they have to be careful.
It's not as simple as saying China's a benevolent partner or a neo-colonial power.
Exactly. There are a lot of nuances here.
There are. Okay, so you mentioned something earlier that I want to go back to.
Okay,
You said something about healthy competition.
right.
What did you mean by that?
Well, China's not the only player in Africa.
Oh, right, of course.
Western nations, especially those with historical ties,
Mm-hmm.
are also investing in infrastructure energy development projects, the whole shebang.
Right.
And so the panel talked about whether this competition could actually benefit African nations.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, so one of the experts said that this competition creates leverage
Oh, see.
for African governments,
Mm-hmm.
allowing them to negotiate better deals and play different actors against each other.
So it's like a bidding war.
In a way, yeah.
Okay.
But of course, African nations have to be strategic about it,
Yeah.
can't become pawns in a bigger geopolitical game.
So they've got to walk a tightrope,
Yeah,
balancing these relationships, making sure their own interests are front and center.
definitely.
Now, one thing that really struck me throughout this whole discussion was the emphasis on stability.
Mm-hmm. Stability is absolutely crucial for economic development. Investors are much more likely to put money into countries with stable political environments
Yeah, that makes sense.
and predictable regulatory frameworks.
Right.
And this is where China's involvement in security cooperation in Africa becomes really important.
Okay, so we're talking about more than just trade and investment here.
Right. It goes deeper than that.
What does this security cooperation actually look like?
So China's been increasingly involved in peacekeeping missions in Africa.
Okay.
They're providing training and equipment to African militaries,
Mm-hmm.
and they even set up their first overseas military base in Djibouti.
Wow.
And so the panel debated the implications of this growing security presence.
I bet.
Some argued it's a good thing,
Right.
it's a positive step towards stabilizing conflict-ridden regions,
Right.
while others were concerned about the potential for, militarization and erosion of sovereignty.
So even in the area of security,
Yeah.
we have to think carefully about those potential benefits and risks.
It's a recurring theme.
It is, yeah.
When we're talking about the China-Africa dynamic.
It's a recurring theme in a lot of things we talk about on the show.
Yeah,
There's a lot at stake for both sides.
definitely.
Navigating this relationship requires, a really nuanced understanding
Mm-hmm.
of the historical context, is the geopolitical dynamics, and the specific needs and aspirations of African nations.
It's not simple.
Not at all.
Yeah.
I feel like this has really opened my eyes to how complex this relationship really is.
Yeah.
It's not just about China bringing investment and development to Africa. It's about power, influence, competition.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, it's about African nations charting their own course.
Finding their own way.
Yeah, in this rapidly changing world.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really crucial aspect of this discussion,
Okay.
the role of African agency.
Okay, African agency. Let's
Right.
unpack that. What does that mean in this context? How are African nations actually shaping their own destinies
Mm-hmm.
amidst all these external forces?
It's a great question.
It is a great question.
Yeah.
I'm glad I thought of it.
Well, for one thing, African nations are becoming more assertive.
Oh, that's good.
They're demanding better terms from their partners,
Good.
both Chinese and Western.
That's great.
They're also increasingly working together
Okay.
through regional organizations like the African Union
Mm.
to kind of present a united front on these key issues.
So strength in numbers.
Exactly.
Yeah,
But there's still a long way to go.
right. So it's about moving beyond that old donor-recipient dynamic and toward a more equal partnership where
Mhm.
African nations have a seat at the table.
Yeah, they want a voice
They want a voice.
in shaping those rules of the game.
And this is where things get really interesting.
It does.
Because ultimately, the future of Africa will be determined not just by China's actions,
Right.
but by the choices and the actions of African leaders, entrepreneurs, citizens.
It's about them.
Yeah, and this is where it becomes particularly relevant to you, our listener.
Absolutely.
Because it's easy to get caught up in the big picture, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The geopolitical maneuvering.
Like billions of dollars.
All the big numbers.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, this is about people's lives.
Right.
This is about the future of a continent with incredible potential.
Yeah. And that's what we'll keep digging into.
Yes.
As we continue this deep dive. We're going to look at specific examples
Love it.
of how this China-Africa relationship is actually playing out on the ground.
Okay.
How's it impacting communities,
Yeah.
businesses, individuals?
Right.
We're going to hear from diverse voices, from entrepreneurs who are building successful companies to activists who are raising concerns about environmental sustainability and human rights.
This is where we get into the nitty-gritty.
Yes.
The successes, the challenges, and the stories of individuals and communities who are navigating this really complex landscape.
It's going to be fascinating.
I am so excited to keep going with this. So stay with us as we continue this deep dive into the multifaceted relationship between China and Africa.
Definitely stay tuned. So, picking up where we left off, it's important to actually look at how this African agency plays out in real-world scenarios.
Okay.
So let's consider the African Continental Free Trade Area.
FCFTA.
Or AFCFTA, yeah, which aims to create a single market across most of the continent.
Yeah.
Reduce those trade barriers and boost intra-African trade.
I know some of our listeners might be thinking, okay, another trade agreement. What's so special about this one?
Well, for one thing, it has the potential to really significantly increase trade within Africa itself.
Okay.
Reducing that reliance on those external partners.
So less dependence on exporting those raw materials to China or the West.
Exactly.
More focus on building those internal markets and trading with each other.
Precisely. And what's really interesting is that China has actually been a vocal supporter of AFCFTA.
Oh, really?
Yeah. One of the panelists, who was a trade expert, argued that China sees this as an opportunity to further integrate African economies into its own global supply chains.
So even while encouraging African nations to move up the value chain, there's a strategic element for China in supporting something like AFCFTA.
For sure.
It's about ensuring their continued access to these markets as they evolve.
Exactly. And that's where African agency comes back into play.
Right.
The success of AFCFTA really hinges on African nations effectively implementing the agreement, making sure it benefits their own populations and not just those external actors.
That sounds like a balancing act.
It is.
Embracing those opportunities for economic integration while safeguarding their own interests.
Definitely.
Now let's talk about another aspect of this relationship that often sparks debate: the impact on the daily lives of people in Africa.
Right. This is where things get even more nuanced.
Okay.
The panel discussed specific examples of how Chinese companies operating in Africa have been criticized for labor practices.
Yeah, I've heard about this.
Yeah, and one case study actually focused on a textile factory in Ethiopia where workers were reportedly subjected to long hours and low wages.
So concerns about exploitation, unfair working conditions potentially undermining local labor standards.
All valid concerns that were raised by several panelists, and they really emphasized the need for greater transparency and accountability from Chinese companies operating in Africa.
What about the perspective of African workers themselves? Did the panel address that?
Yeah, several panelists actually highlighted the need to include African voices in these discussions.
Of course.
They argued that while there are legitimate concerns about labor practices, it's also important to recognize that Chinese investment has created job opportunities
Right.
in sectors where they were really scarce before.
So it's not a simple black and white situation.
Not at all.
There are potential downsides, but also potential benefits, and it's crucial to understand the perspectives of those who are directly affected.
Absolutely. The panel also discussed the impact of Chinese goods flooding African markets.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
One panelist, an economist, pointed out that while these goods are often more affordable,
Yeah.
they can also undercut local industries.
So potential double-edged sword there,
Yeah.
providing consumers with more affordable options, but potentially harming local businesses that can't compete on price.
Exactly. And this highlights the need for African governments to develop those industrial policies that support local industries,
Right.
while also leveraging the opportunities presented by global trade.
So it's about finding that balance right.
It is.
Protecting local businesses
Yeah.
while also benefiting from access to those global markets.
Yeah, it's a tough needle to thread.
It is. Now, this deep dive has really shed light on the complexities of China's relationship with Africa.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is. But what about the broader implications? How does this all impact the rest of the world?
Well, as China's influence in Africa continues to grow, it inevitably impacts that global balance of power.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The panel discussed how this is actually leading to increased competition between China and those Western nations
Right.
for influence and access to resources in Africa.
So we're talking about a potential shift in the geopolitical landscape.
Yeah, it's shifting for sure.
What does this mean for countries like the U.S., for example?
Well, one panelist who was a former diplomat argued that the U.S. really needs to reevaluate its approach to Africa.
Oh.
They suggested that instead of viewing the continent primarily through a security lens,
Right.
the U.S. should focus on building stronger economic partnerships
Okay.
and supporting those African-led development initiatives.
So a more collaborative approach rather than one based on competition or rivalry.
Exactly. And this is where things get even more interesting, because the panel also discussed the role of other emerging economies,
Oh, like who?
like India and Brazil, for example,
Okay.
in Africa.
So it's not just a two-player game between China and the West anymore.
Not anymore.
There are multiple actors vying for influence, and this could actually create new opportunities for African nations.
Absolutely. And this is where African agency becomes even more crucial.
Right.
The panelists emphasized that African nations have this incredible opportunity to leverage this competition to their advantage, negotiate those better deals, attract more investment, and ultimately shape their own destinies.
I like that.
Yeah.
This deep dive has been truly enlightening. We've gone from exploring the historical context of China's engagement in Africa to unpacking the complexities of mutual benefit, examining the economic, social, and security implications.
It's a lot.
It is.
lot.
And ultimately highlighting the crucial role of African agency in navigating this evolving relationship.
Absolutely. And as we move forward, it's important to remember that this is an ongoing story.
It is.
The relationship between China and Africa is going to continue to evolve,
Of course.
and its impact will be felt not just on the continent itself, but on the global stage.
This deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
It has.
But before we wrap up, I want to bring it back to you, our listener,
Yes.
because ultimately, understanding these global dynamics is not just about acquiring knowledge.
Right.
It's about becoming more informed citizens, engaging in those meaningful conversations, and maybe even challenging our own assumptions about the world.
Absolutely. And as we continue to explore this topic, we encourage you to ask questions, seek out those diverse perspectives, and consider how you as an individual can contribute to a more just and equitable global society.
It's easy to get caught up in, all the narratives we hear about Africa, often framed around challenges and deficits and things like that.
Right.
But what really struck me in this panel discussion was this emphasis on Africa's potential.
Yeah.
Its resources, its youthful population, that entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah, we need to hear more of that.
Yeah.
The panelists highlighted all this incredible innovation happening across the continent.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, for instance, they discussed the growth of mobile banking in Kenya,
Oh, yeah.
which has revolutionized financial inclusion and really empowered millions of people.
That was like a whole different story than the one we're usually told.
Right.
And this isn't just about like isolated success stories.
No.
The panel pointed to a broader trend of African nations taking ownership of their development agenda.
Absolutely. One panelist, a prominent African entrepreneur, argued that the narrative needs to shift
Oh, how so?
from, what can the world do for Africa to what can Africa do for the world?
Wow.
They emphasize the importance of supporting African-led solutions, investing in local talent, and fostering an environment where innovation can flourish.
So it's about recognizing that Africa isn't just a recipient of aid or a source of resources.
Right.
It's a dynamic force shaping its own future and contributing to global progress.
Exactly. And this requires, a fundamental shift in mindset, both within Africa and in the way that the rest of the world engages with the continent.
So instead of focusing on the problems, we need to be amplifying the solutions,
Yes.
highlighting the successes,
Absolutely.
and recognizing the agency of African nations and individuals in driving that change.
And this is where you, our listener, come in.
Okay.
We've unpacked a lot of information, explored these complex dynamics, and hopefully challenged some assumptions.
I think we did.
Now it's about what you do with this knowledge.
That's right.
It's about staying curious, seeking out those diverse perspectives, and engaging in informed conversations about the future of Africa and its role in the world.
Because ultimately, this isn't just about Africa.
Right.
It's about understanding that interconnectedness of our world, recognizing those shared challenges and opportunities that we face, and working together to build a more sustainable and equitable future for all.
So as we conclude this deep dive, we leave you with a final thought.
Okay.
Challenge the narratives.
Yes.
Engage with the complexities and recognize that the story of Africa is still being written. And it's a story that each of us in our own way can help shape.